UnCharitable. How the heck did this movie come about? And let's go a little bit further just so people who don't know you.
Yeah, it started with a book I wrote for Tufts University Press in 2009 called UnCharitable after I had created the AIDS Rides and the Breast Cancer 3 Days, and we raised almost $600 million in 9 years. But during the journey of that success, we were pretty regularly, mercilessly crucified for having high overhead and paying people good salaries. And, I was sort of cataloging all of these dysfunctional ways our culture thinks about charity while we were building that company and while it was succeeding, and knew that I wanted to write a book about it. We went out of business suddenly in 2002 because of those issues, and then I wrote the book, and I knew when I wrote the book that it would be good subject matter for a documentary. It was I was going to TED and saw Al Gore give his TED talk, and then watched as that became a movie, and I thought the issues we cover in this book would be great for a documentary. It just took a long time to raise the money for it.
Yeah, documentaries are tough sledding. I have been parts of documentaries. And so this documentary fleshes out the argument you made in your TED Talk. And I thought the TED Talk was very compelling and correct, in part because in a past life, I started and ran a nonprofit. So I have some jokes around starting nonprofits, that nonprofits run on two things: passion and money.
Yeah.
And one of the dark truths of being a nonprofit founder is that the way to get the money is to talk about the passion. But then, even as you're talking about the passion, you're thinking, okay, how do I get the money?
Right. Yeah. And if you think about it, a lot of times people in the nonprofit sector will say, we have to beg for money, we have to beg for money. Well, guess what? Entrepreneurs have to beg for money too. It's not just the nonprofit sector where you're begging for money. It's in the nonprofit sector, people have miniaturized ambitions, as Susan Beresford at the Ford Foundation used to say, about how much money they're entitled to. Like the nonprofit sector doesn't distinguish the concept of capital. Nonprofits think of their capital as whatever's in their petty cash. So if they get $23,000 in their petty cash, that's the money they can use to create something new, whether that's a new fundraising endeavor or a new program. Well, that's not how entrepreneurs in the for-profit sector think about it. They think about, what scale do I want this idea to enter the marketplace at? How much money would it cost to bring it out at that scale? And let me go to the capital markets and get that much money so I can do it right. Their dreams aren't limited by the amount of money in the bank account. And so this oversight of the concept and power of capital in the nonprofit sector is a big problem, and it's driven by the fact that the sector has been so oppressed, that so many of the freedoms we give to business have been taken away from the nonprofit sector in the name of some kind of an ethic. And the bottom line message of the movie and the TED Talk is, you want to know why nonprofits haven't changed the world the way we hoped that they would? Because that is not what we asked them to do. We asked them emphatically and consistently, and we still do, keep your overhead and your salaries low. So that's what they did. And if you keep your overhead and your salaries low, we will reward you with donations, regardless of the fact that you may not be having any impact in the world. And impact becomes an entirely secondary thing.
Yeah, that I have stories along those lines. I started a nonprofit, Venture for America. I donated some money of my own to start it, and then I went around and shook down some rich friends for money. A number of years later, we had some success, and I was getting a grant from major financial institution, and the CEO comes and gives us social entrepreneurs, uh, frankly, a pretty bad pep talk, and then talking about that now that we have the resources, we can go out and change the world. And literally, I think my organization got $25,000 from this particular grant.
Yeah.
And so that there was something ridiculous about it. It's like, wait a minute, like, we all know you're a multi-billionaire and this is a major financial institution, and then you give us 25K. And then it's like, and now with this incredible level of resources, like go out and do something awesome. And it's like, shit, man, I could point to anyone in your building and it's like $25,000 covers them for, you know, like 3 months.
Yeah.
Or actually some of them probably like, 2 weeks, 1 week.
Yeah, we were with the AIDS rides and the breast cancer 3 days as of 2002. We were netting after all expenses about $81 million a year. Now, if you put a multiple of 5 or 6 on that, right? You got a half billion, $750 million company, and people would ask me, "Oh, that's great that you do that. Do you volunteer?" Like the misconceptions, like, no, there are 400 full-time people involved, paid employees involved in making that happen. And I think what you're talking about, the $25,000 gift is indicative of the idea of the fact that we don't consider the nonprofit sector to have the potential to be a lead player in changing the world. We don't think that the nonprofit sector could do that. We think of it as a gesture. We think of it as something nice that people dabble in when they're retired or when they're done with their day, and it's why I challenge anyone to go back and listen to all of the presidential debates of the last 5 decades and see if you hear the nonprofit sector mentioned once as a critical element of how we solve problems for the least among us. And as it's currently constrained, it's not capable of taking on that role. But if we released it from these anachronistic constraints, and what do I mean by that? I mean, well, we don't allow nonprofits to use money to attract the absolute best people to solve problems. We don't allow nonprofits to advertise so that they can excite the general public about the work that they're doing and grow. We don't allow them to take risks when it comes to new fundraising and new ways to grow. We measure them in 12-month increments, so we don't give them any time, and we don't give them a capital market. And the for-profit sector gets all of those things. Well, if you gave all of those things to the nonprofit sector, it could address the issues with the help of business and government, but could take the lead in addressing the issues of poverty that still remain at 14% in the United States, illiteracy that's been at 14% for the last 4 decades, breast cancer, where the mortality has been hovering around 40,000 for the last 4 decades with no change, suicide, where the mortality now approaches 40,000, up from 10 years ago. All of these problems are problems where the nonprofit sector is uniquely doing on-the-ground R&D that nobody else is doing to figure out what innovations might work at solving those problems, but they don't have the scale. The problems are massive in scale. Massive in scale. These are multi-billion, decabillion problems, and we want our charities to be small. And when they start to get too big, we think, oh, I'm going to give to this other charity because they're big enough. Well, not if they haven't solved the problem. They're not big enough, right?
Well, the ideal nonprofit puts itself out of business, which, as you're saying, never happens
Yeah.
because the nonprofits aren't actually designed to hit a scale where they can solve the problem. Uh,
Yeah, and I'm sorry to interrupt, but one of the things that kills me is this notion that people say, well, we need to make our nonprofit sustainable. Nobody wants your nonprofit to be sustainable. They want you to go out of business. I had a client call me 5 years ago, say, we're celebrating our 50th anniversary as a breast cancer organization, 25th anniversary as a breast cancer organization. We want to tell people everything we're going to do in the next 25 years. I mean, do you realize how ironic that is? People don't want breast cancer to be around in another 25 years. They don't want to be celebrating anniversaries. They want these problems to be ended.
yeah, so I want to break down for people a little bit how the growth factors are totally different, just from my own experience. So check it out. I ran an education company, and let's say I did a really good job for you, and then you tell your friend, and then your friend's like, oh, maybe I should use this company too, and then they tell their friend. And so the better job I do, the more I grow. In the
Right.
nonprofit segment, let's say I was helping hungry people. If I help a hungry person well, maybe they tell their friend who's also hungry who shows up. but that actually has nothing to do with my growth in terms of donations. Like you have a totally different marketplace you're dealing with
Yes.
in the form of donors as opposed to the people you provide services for.
Yeah, I'll do workshops with nonprofit organizations. I might have 300 people in a room on a Saturday, all board members from different organizations and staff, and consistently somebody will say we're growing by leaps and bounds, and I'll say, oh, that's great. So how much more money did you raise this year than last year? Oh, we didn't raise any more money. Okay, well, what do you mean by growth? Well, we've got twice as many people who want our services for free, right? Well, that's not growth. That's a problem, right? If you've got twice as much demand, but you don't have the money to meet the demand, then that's a real problem. Yeah.
So the organization I started was called Venture for America. The goal was to train entrepreneurs to create companies and jobs around the country in the hope of uplifting and invigorating the economy and the culture. My thesis was that we had too many young people heading to Wall Street, consulting firms, and the rest
Yeah.
of it, law school, and that they should be building things and creating jobs. So I realized that our organization was never going to be able to create hundreds of thousands or millions of jobs in the way that I wanted to. And I ended up running for president because the trends that I was concerned about around automation and its effect on the labor market were just speeding up, which is one reason why I'm so excited by your work, Dan, because you've documented essentially, look, the nonprofit sector is capped at a low level. I think you said it was 2% of the economy
GDP.
or so, and that's constant. Also relatively constant. The poverty level, it's like, hey, if we're making such great progress, like why have these numbers not changed meaningfully? And I concluded the only way to fix things would be to get a hold of the federal government and then remake the economy. That led to my presidential run. I dare say that you probably should have run for president at some point.
It was when I was a kid, and when I was 19 years old, I ran for the school board in my hometown and won, and that's when I was really realizing that I was gay, and there were no out gay politicians in 1989, and I look at it as, look, this is not the sexiest issue, getting people to think differently about charity, getting people to liberate charities, but it's the service it's the service to which I feel I have been called, because that sector needed leadership. And I think it can make, if we're successful in changing the way the culture thinks about charity, the difference that can be made there is enormous.
All
Perhaps
right,
bigger
Dan.
than what you could do as president.
No, Dan. I'm going to introduce to you because here we're chasing a common vision. In my opinion, the current economy actually is becoming increasingly punitive and inhuman. Where just to use one field that is probably near and dear to some people watching this, creatives. I'm going to say being a creative is much, much harder now than it was. You have this increasing winner take all creative economy. My generation, you might have made living as a musician. Now, even if you get a million streams, you're going to get paid, $1,000
Right.
for that. And you have this winner take all effect, where it's like a handful of mega stars, but then working creatives, it gets harder and harder. The fields are getting tougher. AI is going to get stronger. And so people ask me, hey, what is the future of the economy? And when I was running for president, I said, just give everyone money. Universal basic income, $1,000 a month was what I was running on. But here's the true vision. Our economy is going to make it so more and more of us are not competitive in terms of capital efficiency. But there are all of these goals that we should have for ourselves as a society that aren't about me out competing the machine or whatnot. Things around arts and creativity, or caring and nurturing, or education, or health and self development, or making someone else stronger and healthier, either physically or mentally. So what I said was, look, we're going to have to create new currencies to allow people to find structure, purpose, and fulfillment, taking these routes that may not right now have a marketplace.
I step back and I think about the vision that Buckminster Fuller had, this famous mathematician and philosopher, and he talked about, he got very specific, which is important, a world that works for everyone with no one and nothing left out. It's like when Kennedy said, I believe this nation should commit itself to the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth. Like, if you weren't serious about that dream, it would never dawn on you that you got to get the guy back safely as well. But this idea of a world that works for everyone with no one and nothing left out. Okay, excluding the issues we're currently talking about, the market economy seems to be able to get developed economies 90% of the way there, 87% of the way there. We got 87% of people taken care of, whether it's through capital or cell phones or whatever it is. We got most of the problem taken care of. Infant mortality rates are way down. Literacy rates are up in all of the developed countries. Yeah, but that 13%, that 10% that got left behind, the market economy has no answers for those people. Why?
Yeah.
Because there's nothing to monetize there, right?
Yeah.
Which is what you were talking about. Like, how do you monetize the value of taking care of an elderly woman? How do you monetize the love someone gets out of Special Olympics? And that's where philanthropy comes in. And so, you and I have talked about the idea of the need for a Department of Philanthropy. I think a Department of Philanthropy and social improvement at the level of the White House.
And in the movie UnCharitable, it talks about paying people for results, where it's like, look, instead of I give you the organization the money and then you do some good work, but you may or may not solve the problem, it's like, look, in this instance, I'm just going to pay you for the good that is done.
Yes, I do want to address something you said earlier about growth. You were talking about the growth of the problem versus the growth of the revenue, and I was as well. But what if a nonprofit is growing in the way that you want? They actually are impacting the problem. And Billy Shore talked about this in the movie. He said, here's what I tell a donor. If I can get you 1% overhead, but hunger isn't being solved anywhere, or I can get you 35% overhead and hunger is being solved in 40 of the 50 states, which his organization has done, which is the better deal for you? Well, right now, the culture thinks of that 1%. That's what I want. I want 1% overhead and the problem not getting solved. So in the case of an organization like No Kid Hungry, what they struggle with is, or other organizations, we've got an overhead ratio that could make us a target for the media to attack us and misconstrue what we're doing, when in fact we're actually ending hunger. So we don't value the right things. But I think in terms of your social credit idea and my idea of a world that works for everyone with no one and nothing left out, you're going to get more and more consolidated money, right, in the hands of Elon Musk and in the hands of Jeff Bezos and others. And that's where philanthropy, and I would tuck your idea into that, becomes more important in becoming scientific about philanthropy, scientific about what works, scientific about capitalizing the things that work, not just the things that pull on your heartstrings, but the things that are actually working, which is why I get apoplectic when I see these tax the rich declarations. It's so lacking in rigor. Tax the rich and then do what with the money?
And then do what?
Yeah, you don't have a second sentence to that. Like,
we don't know.
Yeah, like, how about identify? Yeah, we don't know. How about identify solutions that work? And then I'm in favor of taxing the rich to fund those. If you're, as you said earlier, if you're a nonprofit and you want a $25,000 grant, you go to a foundation, you got to give them all kinds of data on how you know that this is working, everything else. But the federal government, no, just give us lots of money. We don't have any data on anything that works, but just give us the money, right? It's so lacking in rigor. It's so wasteful. It drives me insane. Big government versus small government, that's a false dichotomy. What about what's going to solve problems? It might be big government, but let's figure out what the answers are, and then have the size of government follow the methodology, you know?
Yeah. You just want effective systems. I mean, like there are examples of things where, and I think your movie talks about it, where a lot of money might be spent on homelessness in a particular city, and yet you go and it's like, hey, homelessness actually hasn't been meaningfully impacted or improved.
Right.
There are places where we're spending lots of money on education and then it doesn't work, and then it's like, oh, let's spend more money, and there's absolutely no difference in
Absolutely.
impact. And then if you were to say, hey,
But
let's
if the overhead is low and the CEO is paid a low salary, we love that organization, even though no difference is being made. That's the
yeah,
whole twisted lens through which we look at this stuff.
yeah, your vision is vital for us to get to a better place. That your insight that, look, we treat philanthropy as this kind of stepchild that we can pat on the head and just like pay lip service to, but we don't actually expect it to be competitive. We don't expect it to enlist the best people and pay them whatever the market rate is. Uh, we don't expect them to solve the problem. We expect them to keep their costs low, like regardless of what that might mean. One of the things you and I have in common is that we've both been growth operators in different contexts. And when you're a growth operator, you actually find you need awesome people, and
Yeah.
awesome people can very much be mission driven, but awesome people also need advancement, and that can include compensation advancement if they're going to stick with you past a certain number of years. Like an awesome person might show up and do something great and cool for a particular period of time, but then they'll say, okay, like I'm getting drawn to this other cool thing. Oh, and by the way, this other thing will also pay me better, and I'm getting married and I'm having kids and the rest of it. I mean, there's like an entire maturation cycle for both orgs and individuals. Uh, so I would love to see you unlock the philanthropic sector so that it is able to compete on these dimensions that you listed, which are compensation, advertising, time, risk taking, and what was the fifth?
Capital.
Oh yeah, of course,
Yeah,
capital
yeah, yeah.
markets.
Right, right.
Um, so those, if we could do that, it would be awesome. And you're totally right that my idea for currencies to reward positive behaviors or measure progress and performance would get folded into what you imagine as like a much more robust nonprofit sector.
Yeah.
Like what proportion of the economy? So let's say right now the nonprofit sector is 2% of the economy. What do you think the target or the goal or the potential is?
It's I think there are two ways we can grow the nonprofit sector. One is increasing donations, and in the TED Talk I said if we went from 2% of GDP to 3% of GDP, and that increase went disproportionately to health and human services organizations, that would be a massive transfer. Because right now, it's actually about a 1.2, $1.3 trillion sector. And if you think of it as a pie, a third of it is fees for services, so nonprofit hospitals that charge you or museums that charge you a ticket. A third of it is government contracts, and a third of it is philanthropy. And philanthropy is now getting close to about $500 billion, $500 billion a year. But of that, only about 18% is health and human services, and only about 18% of philanthropy. So you're talking about, maybe 180, 90, $100 billion for health and human services. Well, that's where all the problems are. That's where all the suffering is that we want to eradicate. So if you allowed those organizations that are really doing the best work to promote themselves and bring in more donations and really grow so that they could begin to address the problem, an increase of $100 billion in donations that went directly to that sector would be transformative. But also, the consolidation of the sector is something that we need to look at. There are 1.5 million nonprofits in the United States. There are about 100 new nonprofits formed every day. We simply do not need 73,000 organizations working on breast cancer, right? We need one or two or three, the way we have Samsung and Apple. But because we've removed all financial incentive from the nonprofit sector, because money is bad, and the nonprofit sector wanting money is bad, there's no financial incentive to merge. And money is what motivates all the M&A activity in the for-profit sector. In the nonprofit sector, you just have holy points. And so if you merge, you lose your holy points, and that's the last thing you want. So, my best thinking on that is provide some kind of financial incentive. Maybe it's a tax credit, not a deduction, a credit.
Dude, the Secretary of Philanthropy, you're gonna lead the giant roll up. You're gonna be like, you know what? Let's see if we can
Yeah, like you and
combine
I,
forces.
right, thinking about these things and bringing imagination to the sector. Like, let's create a $1 billion a year. It's a rounding error on giving. iTunes for Charity that gives Americans a website they can go to and get up to date, really great information on the impact that every organization is making. In addition to the financial data, we don't have anything like that right
You
now.
know what? My bright idea, Dan, when I was running for president, I was going to give everyone 200 philanthro dollars that you can just give to any nonprofit you want any given year, use it or lose it, and it just turns everyone into a customer. And if you help them, it actually pays, and it grows the sector because it's like, who cares?
Yeah, but first we got to get people thinking right? We got to get them giving to the correct organizations. Like I would go and speak in philanthropy classes all the time, undergrad philanthropy classes, and the class had 10 grand to give away. And they'd bring me in at the end of the semester, and it would screw everything up because they realized they had been asking they were ready to give away all this money, and they had asked all the wrong questions. They had asked about overhead and about salaries. But like you and I are imaginative people, we're creative people, and that's what we need in government. Forget about all this moralizing and where do you stand on all the moral issues. Can we basically agree that we're all decent people? We just have different approaches to it. Let's give the money to the creative people, to the imaginative people. Like I look at the big foundations in America. There's $1 trillion in the corpuses of America's foundations, and you take the biggest ones, the MacArthur's and the Annie Casey's and the Fords and those, like, why don't those 10 leaders get together and say, hey, why don't we each put in $5 million this year? It is a rounding error, not even on our corpus, on our grant making. That's $50 million, and let's buy half the ads on the Super Bowl and educate the American public about the importance of the nonprofit sector in America. Let's put some of our money together and build a robust iTunes for charity. Let's do structural things that change philanthropy in the sector. That's why we need something like a Department of Philanthropy, because that imagination is just not forthcoming, and we desperately need it.